Hey everyone, Dan Johnston here. I'm the Jack of all Ministries, here to help you make it happen. And today I'm going to show you how I made these acoustic panels for my home studio. So I'm making this video today because when I originally finished my studio, I didn't like the panels that I chose. I just wanted to get something up on the wall, so I got some cheap foam stuff from Amazon, threw it up there to give me a little bit of sound control. But obviously that wasn't going to be my, permanent solution. And so I came up with these panels, which I think, look better, and they definitely function better. And so I'm going to show you exactly how I made them. And at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a little bit of a demonstration on how well they work versus what I had before. So to start this project, I knew that I was going to end up making 8, or really 8.5, or I guess it's 8 because it's 2 halves. I don't know. It's 8 panels in this room, and one of them is kind of cut in half because of my window plug, and I'll show you that when I get to it in a little bit. But I wanted to make 8 of these in my room so that I could control the sound. So to begin the building process, the first thing I had to do was figure out the locations and the sizes for the panels. And so basically, to keep things simple, I'll go ahead and start with my explanation of what I did on the horizontal axis in the room. Basically, I knew that these things were going to be 16 inches wide because the insulation I was filling them with was designed to go between studs that are 16 on center. Because I used 3/4 inch MDF on the edges, that gave me a perfect 16-inch box that I was trying to stuff these things into. And so with that, I knew that I wanted it to be centered on my door. I thought it would be weird to have it kind of, pushed off to the side or whatever. So that really gave me an anchor point. But because I wanted these things to be symmetrical in the room, I had to kind of work around some obstacles. The first obstacle is I wanted to make sure that I didn't, cover up my light switch because I kind of need to use that. I also didn't want to cover up the breaker box across the way, and then I also didn't want to cover up too much of the window plug. I knew that one of them was going to have to be cut in half, but I didn't want to, cover it from the side as well. So that really gave me some things that I had to fight with, but honestly, it actually worked out perfectly because once I hung the first one centered with the door, the next closest position I could put any other panel is right up against the door frame. So that really dictated to me what the minimum width apart these things could actually be. And so when I went to the other side and looked, it ended up being a perfect position to put them snug against the door frame and then still on the other side be in the perfect position where I was on one side of the breaker box and on the other side of the window plug without having to cover anything up. And so because that pretty much locked in what the distances were going to be, I just moved that around the rest of the room, kept it symmetrical and nice, and everything landed perfectly in a horizontal sense. Now, figuring out the vertical location of these things was a little bit different. I wanted to get as much height out of it as I possibly could, and that was again dictated to me by my room. Because I added this acoustical cloud above my workstation, I knew that I couldn't go any higher than, the lowest part of that cloud. And so that basically set a height limit for my panels. But basically the next question is how low could I go? And then that was also going to dictate the total height of the panel. So the next obstacle I had to worry about was I have this AC, kind of vent port where I can hook my portable air conditioner into it to vent it out to the outside. And I know I couldn't go any lower than that. So I gave it a couple inches just to make sure I had some flex room so I could move the hose around and stuff like that. And so that meant that I was going to make these panels about 39 inches tall. And so from that point on, I had my position and I had my dimensions. I was going to be making 16 by 39 inch panels to put them on my wall. Of course, there is the one exception though, because I do have a window plug which goes right in the middle of one of the panels, and I decided to go ahead and make 2 separate panels so that if I ever remove that window plug, I can just take the top portion off and still have the rest of the panel still sitting in place. And so for that, I had to make an 8 by 16 inch panel and then a 30 7/8 by 16 inch panel. That way I had an 1/8 of an inch gap there in between. So for step 2, I had to cut all of the framing material. Now you could build these frames out of lumber if you wanted to, but for me, I thought it was going to be just cheaper if I bought myself a sheet of 3/4 inch MDF and then just cut everything on the table saw and with a circular saw in order to get the framing pieces that I needed. So to help figure out what the cuts were going to be, I used an app called Cutmaster. And basically this is a really great app where you can just plug in the sizes that you need, plus the sizes of your like source material, and then you can factor in certain things like, like the kerf on your blade, or you can factor in grain direction and stuff like that. But for cutting MDF, it was very simple, and I had a bunch left over when I was done. So it was a pretty simple process of laying out exactly how I was going to make the cuts on this sheet. So once I had the layout figured out in Cutmaster, I went ahead and kind of just did a rough drawing on the sheet of MDF. That way I knew kind of in general where my cuts were going to be, so that I could cut off the larger portions right away, so that when I started using the table saw, I didn't have to worry about, holding an 8-foot sheet of, MDF sideways off the table saw or something. I could cut it down into smaller chunks, and then I could just rip things as I went. So to make those crosscuts, I use the method where, you get a 48-inch level, you can use a piece of wood or something like that too, and you just clamp it down, making sure everything is square, that your measurements are right, and then you just use that as a guide for your circular saw to make sure that you get a perfectly straight cut all the way across. And after I had my smaller pieces, I just went ahead and made those rip cuts right through my table saw, cutting them 4 inches at a time, so that I had all the 4-inch pieces of, lumber essentially that I would need to make the frame for my acoustic panels. So any of the panels that needed to be shorter after I made those cuts, I went ahead and just threw those on the miter saw and just cut those down right to size. And basically what I ended up needing was some 39-inch side rails, and then I needed 14.5-inch kind of cross, like a top plate and a bottom plate. But then I also had kind of a back support there that kind of ended up vertical against the frame. That way I could, kind of holds the insulation in place to keep it from falling out the back. And then I also cut some, 45-degree pieces. I just took one of those, 4-inch strips, just cut a 45, flipped it over and slid it over till it was at the point, and then made another cut. So basically you get 45-degree, right triangles that you can use. And those are really great when you're framing anything, because you stick them in the corner and then, you lock them down, and that really holds everything square for you. And then in this case, it had the added benefit where it also keeps the insulation from falling out the back. So I have that back rail, and then in each corner I have a little 45-degree cut, which helps to hold that insulation in and keep it from falling out the back. Now later I would end up actually stapling some plastic to the back of these things. And I did that mostly because I didn't want the insulation working its way into the room and you end up breathing that stuff. But it's also good because it helps to keep it from falling out as well. I didn't worry about it too much on the front because I used outdoor fabric, which is actually coated and waterproof. So you really don't have to worry about any, insulation working its way out of the front. It was just the back that I ended up being concerned about. So when I got to cutting those 45-degree pieces for the smaller panels that I made for the, panels on my window plug, I ended up having to make those a little bit smaller because they ran into the point where they were too big. They were crossing each other over when I glued them. And then also in the middle, I'm going to end up putting a French cleat. And so I needed to have at least a little bit of room there so that I could mount that to the frame as well. So rather than being a 4-inch piece, it would have been like using a 2-inch piece or something like that for the smaller panel. So that brings us to step 3, which is actually assembling the framing for the panels. So to attach everything, I ended up using wood glue, and then I brad nailed everything together while the glue was drying. That way I didn't have to worry about clamping or anything like that. Plus the brad nails, give a little bit of extra strength in holding things together as well. Now for the piece on the door, I had to use a little bit of a different design, and this was kind of a pain to cover, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But basically I had to frame it up so that there was a notch in here so that the fridge handle that I have that helps me open and close my studio door could fit in there and still be functional. The panels that I had there before, when they were just foam, would actually fit right behind the fridge handle, but these were going to be way too big. They're 4 inches deep, and so I had to make this little notch here, which, simple to frame, simple to glue up, but it did create a little bit of a mess when I was trying to cover that, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So basically I assembled the whole thing. I put the side rails up with the top and bottom plate, the back support, the corner pieces, let that be glued up and dried. And then as soon as it was dry, I got an 1.5 inch spade bit and I drilled 3 holes in each side of this, which exposes a little bit more of the insulation so that when, sound waves are coming through, there's not a vacuum in there, and it allows, more surface area for sound waves to be absorbed and things like that. So it's a helpful thing to do. I probably should have drilled more holes in them, but honestly, I was just too lazy. It took what felt like forever to just drill 3 holes on each side of all 8.5 of these panels. So, if you're making your own, I would recommend drilling more, but honestly, these work great, so I don't think it's really that big of an issue, but it is something to consider. And when that was done, I went ahead and routed a 45-degree bevel all the way around the outside perimeter. I feel like that helped the fabric stretch a little bit better over it, and it just kind of gives it a little bit more of a sleeker shape, I think. You could use a round over bit for that too, because honestly, the fabric doesn't wrap that tightly around the corners, so you really can't tell. But a bevel is what I chose to do, and it came out looking really nice. So step 4 is putting in the French cleats. This is a really great way to hang almost anything on your wall. It's really simple, it's really strong, and it's very easy to take it on and off the wall whenever you need to. So when I'm in my studio, if I ever feel like taking these things off for any reason, I can do it to clean them or whatever I need to do. Also on the window frame, I can just pop it right off when I need to pull the window plug into the room. So it's a very simple, easy way to hang things on your wall that's very strong. So basically I took a 2x4 and I ripped it at a 45-degree angle, as close to center as possible. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered. All that really matters is whichever side you use for the top, you use it on all the panels as the top, and then the other side you use for all the panels on the bottom. Just for uniformity's sake. I mean, you could always, test each one and try to hang it level in the room, but it's just much easier if you use the same side for the top and the bottom of a French cleat if you're going to be having multiple panels. So then I took those pieces and I cut them into 3.5-inch sections, and I made sure to mark each one which was going to be the top, which was going to be the bottom, and then I also made other marks on them so that I wouldn't forget which one was mated to which one, because I wanted it to be as perfect as possible, using the same pieces on the wall. You don't really have to do that, but it was just an extra step that only took 10 more seconds. So I did it just to make sure that the pieces lined up perfectly on the wall together. So then I took the top pieces and I mounted them to the inside portion of the frame up against where the wall was going to be. Now, I used a Forstner bit first to make sure that I could kind of countersink the screws in there. I didn't want any heads sticking out when I wrapped the fabric over it so that you would see bumps or anything like that. So I did that. It's probably unnecessary, but to me, I thought it was worth, a little bit of extra time to get it done. And also you want to make sure that you mount the long edge towards the wall. I actually made the mistake when I first did this and I put it on backwards and I realized that they were never actually going to connect to each other. It was just going to slide right off the wall. So you want the long edge on the panel facing the wall, and you want the long edge on the wall facing the panel, if that makes any sense. So now we're on to step 5, which is actually loading up the insulation into these panels. Now basically this insulation is really easy to cut, and I recommend cutting it down just a little bit shorter than the length. I found out that if you kind of make it slightly long and stuff it in there, you tend to get kind of ripples and waves, and it could kind of protrude through the fabric and stuff like that. So I found it was better just to cut it a little bit short. Now when I cut it, they make these special insulation saws you can use that, they're not too expensive or anything like that, but for me, I just used an old bread knife that I had in the garage that I kind of use for stuff like this, and this stuff really cuts pretty easily. It doesn't take much of a saw motion at all to really get a slice through there, and then once it's cut, you just go ahead and pop it right in the frame, and it's really just that easy. Now I used gloves and long sleeves when I was doing this cutting, because you really don't want to get this stuff on your skin, and I didn't wear a mask. I don't know why I didn't. I probably just wasn't really thinking about it, but really you should, because there's some pretty nasty stuff in there that you really don't want to be breathing in. So I highly recommend wearing a mask, and even wearing some eye protection when you're working with this stuff. Now, I kind of mentioned before that covering this in plastic is a good idea. Some guys actually wrap the insulation completely in plastic, or like in a garbage bag or something like that. And for me, I ended up adding plastic later to the back of the frame, but I didn't really feel like I needed to in the front. But that's something to consider, because over time, you don't want like the metal slag and the glass and stuff like that that's actually in there to work its way out and into the air where you're constantly breathing it, especially if you spend a lot of time in your studio. So now we're on to step 6, which is cutting the fabric. Now, what I did was I got this black outdoor canvas stuff from Walmart, and basically I just bought their entire stock when I went there. I bought way more than I needed. I wanted to be really sure that I was going to have enough, because I would have hated to just run out of fabric and have to try to go find what other Walmart carried that fabric or whatever. So I bought everything they had and made sure that I had plenty left over so that I could have a lot to work with, where I wasn't going to end up trying to fight the fabric for the last inch or whatever. But keep in mind, when you're figuring out how much to buy, you have to worry about the depth as well. So if they're 16 inches wide, you don't need just a 16-inch piece of fabric. You need the 16 inches, plus you need the 4-inch depth, plus you need enough to go over the back and to staple it. And so it's worth it to buy extra and then just cut it down later. So basically, I just cut the 9 different pieces that I needed, and then I took them outside with me so that I could assemble everything on my workbench. And that brings us to step 7, which is actually attaching the fabric to the frames. Now, at first, I was using a narrow crown stapler because I thought having that extra kind of heavy-duty long staple was going to be really good to hold the fabric down. But I ran out of those pretty quick, and I ended up switching over to just regular 3/8 inch, staples with a, staple gun. And that actually ended up working out better because it has kind of a bigger footprint on the staple. And so you don't get so many like stretch marks in it where it really pulls down tight to a narrow point. So I recommend using a wider staple if that's what you're going to use. And really, it was plenty to hold it down to the frame. And so to do this, I laid the fabric down first and then set the frame on top. And then I pulled one side, and making sure that you kind of pull, not just up and over, but you also kind of want to pull down. You want it to stretch vertically as well as horizontally across the frame. So I stapled one side and then reached across, grabbed the other side and pulled that side taut as well, and then stapled that down. Again, kind of pulling on the up and down axis as well to make sure that it was stretched in every direction. Then I pulled the ends up and over and stapled those, again pulling them tight, which left these little flaps sticking out on every corner. Then basically I just took that corner and wrapped it over like you would on a Christmas present or whatever, and then I stapled that down in the back as well. You could staple it on the side if you wanted to, but I didn't want any staples to be visible, so I pulled that around and stapled it only on the back, and so the fold sticks up a little bit, but it's really not, obtrusive when you're looking at it on your wall. Now I decided to wrap that on the top and the bottom because when you're standing in my room, you can see the sides a lot more clearly than you see the top or the bottom, and so for me, I'd rather have the folds kind of hidden, but you do what you like. And after that, I trimmed off the excess because I didn't want a bunch of fabric, sticking in the back and poking out the sides and stuff like that. Wanted to have a, nice clean look. Now, the part that was particularly challenging to cover was this part around the fridge handle that I told you about before. This was hard because there's really no way to bend fabric around that or to fold it in a certain way to keep everything nice and tight because it's an inward corner. Outward corners are easy because you end up with extra fabric to fold over. Inward corners are challenging because you don't have enough fabric to make the stretch that you need to. And so what I ended up doing was I basically just cut kind of a triangle into it, and I pulled those triangles down and stapled them down, but not before I actually took another piece of fabric and kind of lined the inside of it and then folded things over. Honestly, I don't even know how I did it. I just kind of made it up as I went, folding and tucking things and stapling so that really all the staples are in the back except there is one screw that kind of goes down in the front because there was no other way I could think of to do that. And the screw's black so you don't really see it. It's also tucked in there so you don't, the doorknob is kind of there and it's not really something that you focus your eyes on. In the end, it's okay. I wish that it was, more professional looking. Really, I should have asked my daughter to kind of seam something up for me, but I didn't really think about it, and I was kind of in a hurry. So if you're a genius with a sewing machine, you could figure this out better than I did. But honestly, cutting it, folding it, and screwing it worked out just fine for me. And that brings us to step 8, which is the final step in putting these things together, and that is hanging them up on the wall. So what I did was I took the other end of the French cleat and I put it up onto the wall using only one screw. Now, the great thing about using these narrow French cleats like this, normally when you see a French cleat, it can be, the entire width of your project. But for me, I used narrow ones because I knew that I wanted them to be hung very close to the ceiling. Now, what that does is because it's narrow enough, I can actually, set the panel next to it and slide it to the left or to the right in place rather than having to put it over the top and dropping it down. If you do that, whatever the depth is of your angled cut will actually change the height of what you are mounting there. So I would have to leave an inch or 2 inch, gap between the ceiling and the panel if that's the way I was going to do it. But because I made them narrow, I could set it to the side and slide it over, which leaves it nice and snug up against the roof. So basically, I knew how high I needed to mount these because I just measured from the top of the panel to where the angle ended on the cleat and went around the room and, I pre-drilled the cleat and put a screw in there. And so once I held that up to the line where I knew it needed to go, I would just pop a hole in the wall really quick with that screw, get my drill and make the hole wider. And then I went ahead and tapped in the drywall anchors using the back side of my drill because, when you're working, anything can become a hammer. And so I did that. And then I used that same screw that was already in the cleat and screwed that that into the wall, got the panel, set it on the side, slid it right over into the cleat, and everything was locked in and ready to go. Now, one of the reasons I use just a single screw is because that gives me an adjustment that I could make, on the rotation of the cleat. Now, they're nice and tight against the wall, so it's not easy to move. But the truth is that if I didn't like the angle or it didn't seem straight, I could just kind of tilt it over just a little bit and retighten the screw, and I could make sure that I could lock in those panels however I want them to be. Again, I used French cleats because I wanted this to be easy to put on and take off the wall whenever I need to. So the fact that there's just one screw and it can rotate just gives me that little bit of extra adjustment should I ever need it in the future. So now I want to talk about how well these things are actually working in my room. I want to take a look at this RT60 graph, and if you don't know what that is, basically we're talking about reverb or reflections within a room. Basically RT60 is a time measurement. How long does it take for a certain frequency to stop reverberating by 60 decibels. And so basically, if you look at this graph here, you can see here that before the panels were put up, I had these numbers, okay? And then after I hung these up on the wall, I actually saw these numbers. So you can see that the RT60 time is actually pretty significantly reduced from about 133 hertz all the way up to 1000 hertz. And you really see a big reduction here around 250 to about 500 hertz. And then you also see just, kind of a little bit of reduction here in the 4,000 to 8,000 range. And really, I can tell you this. That is a pretty significant difference when you're in here recording something. It's not perfect, but it really is, a pretty decent sounding room to me. Because what's so much more important than how your graphs look is how your room sounds to you. And really, it's pretty flat. Now, some of the lower frequency stuff I had to do a lot more work with, and we'll get to see that in other videos. But for the mid to high frequency, treatment that we did, I'm really happy with what these things do in my room. They sound so much better than it did when I just had that regular phone from Amazon up on the wall. And personally, I think they look better too. Well, that's going to do it for this video, guys. I appreciate that you've taken the time to watch it, and I hope that you found it helpful, particularly if you're thinking about hanging some panels like this in your own home studio. If it was helpful, I'd appreciate it if you consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel, because this is the kind of stuff that I love to tackle. And with that, I hope that you have a great day, and I will see you on the next video.